Hi everyone, and welcome to your lecture on quantitative research, the goals and design, a very short introduction. I want to emphasize just how short this introduction is. I have taken 3 courses on quantitative design and statistical analysis in my graduate degree. I co-taught a course on understanding and appreciating quantitative research, and I still have so much to learn. What I'm going to talk about today in this lecture is what kinds of questions are answered through quantitative studies. So, what is quantitative research? And quantitative research is an approach to testing objective theories by examining the relationship between variables. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about what variables are, how we examine them, and how we approach the idea of an objective theory, and if objectivity is even possible. So, a variable is what you are measuring in your study, and that variable will be different. It'll vary between your research participants or the sample of individuals you are asking a question to. As you choose a variable to study and a sample of people to question about this variable, you'll begin with a hypothesis. You'll predict how this sample of people will respond to this question, what their perceptions are, what their beliefs are, what their practices are. I will give you an example. As a professor, I am interested in how my students who do not identify as having learning disabilities will respond to my students who do have disabilities receiving accommodations in class. So my question is, how do students enrolled in a particular course respond to the fact that some peers receive accommodations for learning disabilities and learning differences? My hypothesis is that in this day and age, students tend to understand the importance of accommodations and do not have the hostility and questions about certain students receiving extended testing time or alternative assignments that were reported decades earlier. So, if I'm going to be studying something with quantitative questioning, here is what that study is going to look like. It's going to use numbers and statistics to figure out answers. I'm going to look at what percentages of my students are comfortable and open and accepting of students who have learning disabilities receiving accommodations versus those who are unaccepting or skeptical of students receiving accommodations. So there's going to be a number, how many. I will have a statistic. There's also generalizable results. If I was going to approach this question through a quantitative study, that quantitative study would be able to be replicated, which means somebody else could also test that hypothesis with their own group of participants who meet the same criteria as my participants. They wouldn't be my exact class, but they would be students who were also the same demographic, the same year, the same sort of course, the same major, something that would make them, however I was defining this demographic, they would be able to replicate that demographic. It wouldn't need to be the exact same people, and then they could do the same thing. They would be able to give them a written survey, or if I decided to conduct a very standardized phone interview where I asked each one the exact same questions and gave them a series of answers they could do that as well. If we were in a laboratory setting, that instead of giving a survey or giving them a phone survey, I decided to measure how their eye movements or their heart rate changed when they were listening to these different scenarios. They could also put them in that same laboratory and do those same kinds of tests with a different group of subjects. Now, another thing is there are few variables with lots of subjects. You'll find that when you're going to do a quantitative study, that finding that exact question, who you're going to ask that question to, and how you are going to measure their responses, it's important that you really narrow that down because you want to be able to ask the same question, test the same hypothesis with a large group of people. That is what makes it a quantitative study. Now, when we do qualitative studies, sometimes we go really in depth and we have lots of variables we're examining with very few subjects, maybe in an open-ended interview or participant observation that we'll talk about later in the semester. But for quantitative, you want few variables with lots of subjects, and you want it to be able to be replicable. So in that situation, we've talked a little bit about this before, those generalizable results are generalizable because it's not just those specific people you asked, but people across that demographic. And in order to see if those results are truly generalizable, we have to be able to replicate the study. We have to be able to resend out that survey. We have to be able to ask those same questions. We have to be able to reproduce that laboratory setting to retest that hypothesis. Things are often anonymous. Now, not always. If you're in a laboratory setting, people are going to know who you are. But often, if we're doing surveys, there's no record of who took that survey or when. We don't keep records of which answer goes with which person because we're much more interested in that generalizable result as opposed to a specific person. So people are often anonymous. Even the researcher would not be able to trace back those answers to the people that gave them. There's also that level of control through an artificial environment. When we have an extremely structured phone call for a phone survey or a paper survey that we're handing out, that they have very specific questions they're answering that we could then send out again, or we are going to create a very controlled laboratory setting that again could be replicated so that we can have a generalizable result through numbers and statistics. That usually means we're not in a natural world or in a situation that has been set up for the researchers in order to be able to study their variable they're interested in. Now, here's a quick reminder. Our goal in quantitative research is to be as objective as possible. We want to be able to not interrupt our data. It's why in a phone interview, you have to stick to the script when it's a quantitative study. This is a poll. We need to ask every single person the exact same questions, give them the exact same choices so we can generalize the results. The idea of we don't want our tone, we don't want our phrasing, we don't want there to be changes of any kind because we're wanting to be as detached from this study as possible to get objective results. However, we do know that we can't get outside our own bodies, we can't get outside our own desires, we can't get outside of our own interests completely. Can we be aware of them? Can we be reflexive to make sure we are not letting them influence any more than they absolutely have to? But when it comes down to it, we choose to ask questions to specific people. And however we decide to do this, part of who we are and our subjective desires for the answers to the questions we ask and how we think people are going to respond to them are going to be present in our research. So instead of ignoring this, embrace that research, knowledge discovery happens through our bodies, through our identities, through the instruments we create, and to do all that we can to not let those biases influence our understandings and readings of the responses of others. We'll talk about this more throughout the semester, but for now, you have a short quiz to take, and then we'll talk a little bit about what sort of quantitative questions you could potentially ask to learn more about the world and produce new knowledge. I'll see you soon. Bye.